is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
The Privy Council was supposed to be controlled, polished, and silent. The kind of royal machinery that moves without emotion. But one figure waiting outside the chamber changed everything. When King Charles saw Andrew positioned near the door, the meeting collapsed before it could begin. In that single moment, protocol gave way to shock, and the monarchy discovered that one closed door could expose years of buried tension. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles arrived with the calm face of a man trained to carry pressure without showing it. Buckingham Palace had already been sealed into that strange royal silence where every footstep feels measured and every whisper sounds dangerous. Senior courtiers, private secretaries, and council officials had gathered because this was not an ordinary palace meeting. The Privy Council, a formal group that advises the monarch and helps approve important state decisions, was expected to confirm sensitive matters involving authority, access, and the future order inside the royal household. That was why the morning mattered. It was not ceremony for ceremony's sake. It was control. It was legitimacy. It was the palace proving that after months of strain, the crown still knew how to govern itself. Andrew stood near the chamber door, as if he belonged there. Charles saw him before anyone could explain, before any aide could step forward, before palace language could soften the blow. The king's expression changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough for everyone close to him to understand that something had cracked. Andrew was dressed formally, waiting with the confidence of a man who expected to be admitted, and that confidence cut deeper than any public insult. To Charles, his brother's presence did not feel like confusion. It felt like a challenge. It felt like someone from inside the family had walked straight toward the one space where private loyalty was supposed to stop, and royal duty was supposed to begin. The decision came with terrifying calm. Charles canceled the Privy Council meeting on the spot, after spotting Andrew waiting at the door, refusing to proceed while his brother remained there. A senior aide moved quietly to the council table and removed the briefing folder, and the soft closing of its leather cover carried more force than a shouted command. Andrew did not move. Charles did not explain himself twice. Officials scattered with lowered eyes, understanding that they had just witnessed more than a postponed meeting. They had seen a monarch choose the institution over blood, pain over weakness, and silence over surrender. Yet, as the chamber emptied and Andrew remained outside the door, one question began spreading faster than the cancellation itself. Who allowed him to get that close? But before the palace could understand why Charles acted so sharply, it had to face the painful truth of who stood on each side of that door. This was not just a king blocking a former working royal. It was a brother refusing to let old loyalties overpower the institution he now carries alone. Charles had spent a lifetime beside Andrew in photographs, ceremonies, and family rituals, but the throne changes the weight of blood. At that door, affection collided with duty, and duty won with devastating force. Charles understood that every royal movement was now being weighed like evidence. A glance, a handshake, a seat at a table, even the wrong person standing near the wrong door could become a message the monarchy never meant to send. The crown was no longer protected by silence alone. It had to prove discipline in moments when family feeling begged for mercy. That was why Andrew's presence near official business felt so dangerous. He was not simply a brother standing in a corridor. He had become a symbol of unresolved tension, a man whose closeness to power could shake public trust before a single word was spoken. And for Charles, that truth carried a private cruelty, because the person he had to stop was someone who had once stood beside him as family, not as a threat. Charles did not move at first. He stood still in the corridor, papers held tight in his hand, his fingers pressing into the edges as the realization settled. Andrew was not lost. Andrew was not passing through. He was waiting to enter. That single detail changed everything. It turned confusion into confrontation. It turned palace routine into a test of the king's nerve. Nearby aides lowered their eyes, sensing that no one wanted to be the first to speak, but silence could not save the moment. When one aide finally stepped toward Andrew and quietly told him the king would not proceed while he remained there, humiliation crossed his face before he could hide it. He had expected access. Instead, he received refusal. Not shouted, not debated, delivered softly, and therefore more final. Camilla heard the news minutes later in a private sitting room, and her reaction revealed how deep the shock had gone. She set down her teacup without drinking, her hand pausing just long enough to show that the cancellation had reached beyond one corridor. Then she asked whether Charles had cancelled everything himself. The answer mattered, because if the king had acted alone, this was not a mistake being managed. It was a line being drawn. And then William's name entered the room like a warning. A palace official confirmed that the prince had already cautioned that Andrew's access to constitutional spaces must be restricted. The future king had seen the danger before the crisis arrived, and now his warning looked less like caution and more like prophecy. The cancellation began to look less like panic and more like the eruption of a private battle that had already been building behind palace walls. And the first real clue lay not in that morning's corridor, but in a previous ceremony everyone had tried to forget. Every royal rupture has a moment people later call the beginning. For Charles and Andrew, that moment had already happened weeks earlier, beneath the polished surface of a private chapel ceremony. No cameras caught the exchange, no public statement named it, but inside the palace, one short conversation after the service became the trigger that made Charles decide Andrew could never again drift near the machinery of power. Charles had arrived at St. George's Chapel, believing the day would pass under careful control. The family had gathered for a private Thanksgiving service, the kind of solemn royal occasion meant to show unity without inviting questions. Everyone understood the rules before a word was spoken. Andrew was expected to remain with the wider family group, away from the senior royal route, away from the officials carrying sensitive papers, and far from any corner where private family standing could be mistaken for restored influence. That mattered because the palace had been fighting to protect one fragile message. The crown could be compassionate without becoming careless. Charles needed calm, Andrew needed distance, and between those two needs sat a silence loaded with years of resentment. Andrew did not treat that silence as a warning. After the service ended, he moved close enough for Charles to hear him without others catching every word. And then came the sentence that changed everything. "I still know how this family works," Andrew told him, placing a hand on the king's arm, as if blood could still open doors that duty had closed. Charles felt the touch before he answered. He felt the history in it too. The childhood, the ceremonies, the old photographs, the private loyalty that once seemed unbreakable. But the remark landed like a challenge. It suggested Andrew believed the past still gave him leverage. It suggested the crown's boundaries could be tested, softened, perhaps even bent. William heard enough from a nearby vestibule to understand the danger beneath the words. The prince did not interrupt, but later, behind closed doors, he told Charles what the king already feared. Andrew's confidence was no longer harmless. It had become a palace risk. That warning carried weight, because William was not speaking as an angry nephew. He was speaking as the future king, a man watching the monarchy's next chapter being shaped by every decision his father made. Within days, a written access note was drafted after the chapel incident, quietly instructing staff to keep Andrew away from rooms where council papers were prepared. It was meant to prevent exactly what later happened. So when Andrew appeared near the Privy Council door despite that instruction, Charles understood it was no accident. It was the very test he feared. So when the two brothers finally came face to face outside the council chamber, the confrontation carried every word left unsaid since that chapel warning. The palace corridor became smaller with every second. Officials stepped back. Aides stopped whispering. Andrew looked toward Charles, as if the old family order might still protect him. But the king did not look like a brother seeking peace. He looked like a monarch measuring a breach. What followed was not loud, but it was brutal. A confrontation so controlled that its silence cut deeper than shouting. Charles felt the weight of the chapel warning return the instant he faced Andrew near the council chamber. This corridor was not an ordinary passage inside the palace. It was a controlled route, where every step was meant to be planned, every arrival checked, and every name cleared before anyone came near the room where royal authority touched state business. The council chamber mattered because it was where the crown's decisions gained formal shape, and the people gathered there understood that access was never casual. Andrew, standing at that door, turned a family problem into something sharper. He was no longer just a brother waiting in the wrong place. He had placed himself between private blood and public power, exactly where Charles had decided he could not be. Charles stepped closer, not with anger, but with a calm that made the moment more dangerous. He asked Andrew why he was there, quietly, firmly, giving him one chance to explain before the room behind them became impossible to save. Andrew answered that he had been told his presence would be understood, and that single word seemed to darken the air around them. Understood by whom? Understood for what purpose? Charles did not raise his voice. He simply looked at him long enough for everyone nearby to know that the answer had failed. Andrew's face tightened when the king refused to soften, and for one brief second, Charles looked away. That glance carried sadness, not weakness. He was not enjoying the humiliation. He was mourning the fact that duty had brought him to this point. Then the decision fell. Charles ordered the chamber cleared and said the Privy Council would not meet that morning. The Privy Council, the formal body that helps approve important royal and state matters, had been stopped not by debate, not by illness, not by delay, but by the presence of one man at one door. A private breach had become an institutional halt. Andrew stayed frozen as officials moved around him, and a courtier noticed something that made the cancellation feel even darker. He glanced toward a side passage, as if expecting someone there to step forward, someone who had assured him this moment would be managed. The door closed, but the silence did not end. Because once Charles canceled the meeting, attention shifted from the man at the door to the unseen hand that had placed him there. A canceled council meeting is never just a canceled meeting. It is a message sent through every corridor of power. After Charles walked away, the palace began tracing signatures, passes, calls, and permissions. Someone had allowed Andrew close enough to trigger a constitutional crisis of confidence. And, as the records were checked, one painful truth emerged. The king's authority had been challenged from inside his own walls. Charles sat alone with the cancelled papers before anyone came to him with answers. The folder that should have carried the morning forward now sat unopened, heavy with everything that had not happened. He had protected the crown, but the cost had landed directly on his family. Andrew had been humiliated. The king had been forced to make that humiliation official, and behind the pain sat a darker problem. Access to Privy Council spaces was not casual. Those areas were controlled through palace scheduling, security clearance, and private office approval, meaning a person did not simply appear there by accident. Someone had to know. Someone had to permit. Someone had to look away at exactly the wrong time. Officials gathered in a small administrative room with the nervous energy of people searching for a mistake they feared was not a mistake at all. Entry logs were opened. Side door notes were compared. Calls were checked against the morning schedule. The abandoned council agenda remained untouched on another table, a reminder that the institution had been stopped because its own safeguards had failed. That mattered because royal authority depends not only on the king's command, but on the machinery around him obeying that command without hesitation. If Andrew could get near the chamber after earlier warnings, then the question was no longer about one brother's pride. It was about whether Charles truly controlled the palace, built to serve him. William arrived after the news reached him, and he carried himself with a restraint that felt sharper than anger. The prince did not storm in. He chose every word carefully, asking whether Andrew had been formally cleared or simply waved through by someone who thought the old rules still applied. Charles looked at him, and for a moment, father and son were not divided by age or rank, but united by the same brutal realization. The future king had warned that Andrew's access to constitutional spaces had to be restricted, and now that warning had become reality. Then a palace secretary found the detail that changed the temperature in the room. Andrew's name had been penciled beside a side door arrival note, crossed out, then re-entered without final authorization. Camilla's office was pulled into the tension when one aide's name appeared near the schedule changes. No one could yet say whether it was influence, carelessness, or quiet interference, but the discovery was enough to deepen the wound. Camilla would now have to answer questions she had not expected to face, and Charles would have to decide how far accountability should go. The question became unavoidable. If Charles canceled the meeting to defend authority, what would happen to everyone who had ignored that authority? The answer came faster than anyone expected, and the first person to feel the new reality was Andrew himself. For Andrew, the worst part was not being turned away. It was realizing that no one rushed to bring him back. No senior figure opened the door. No private secretary repaired the insult. No family member crossed the corridor to defend him. The palace simply moved around him, as if his place in the old order had vanished while he was still standing inside it. Andrew waited in a side room with the stiff silence of a man who expected correction and received absence instead. The council officials had already begun leaving separately, not as a group, not with the calm rhythm of a normal postponement, but with the uneasy caution of people who knew they had witnessed something historic. Briefing papers were returned to locked storage. Planned decisions were postponed under emergency instruction. That mattered because those papers were not ordinary notes. They carried matters of authority, access, and palace order, the very issues Andrew's presence had now interrupted. The institution had not paused for convenience. It had frozen, because the king had decided that one man standing too close to power was enough to end the morning. Andrew sat rigidly as the minutes stretched. A clock ticked above him, each second making the silence feel more final. He had known embarrassment before, but this was different. This was not public noise or distant criticism. This was the palace itself, refusing to turn back toward him. Staff received a new directive while he waited. Andrew was not to be positioned near council chambers, sovereign briefings, or private constitutional meetings. Sovereign briefings were private updates prepared for the monarch on sensitive royal and state matters, and being kept away from them meant more than being denied a room. It meant being pushed outside the trusted circle of royal power. It meant the old assumption that family access could survive any scandal had finally collapsed. Charles felt the cost in another room. He removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead, caught between relief and grief. Relief, because he had acted decisively when hesitation could have made him look weak. Grief, because the person he had stopped was still his brother. The king had defended the crown, but he had done it by allowing Andrew's humiliation to become official. And then came the message Andrew had been waiting for, though not the answer he expected. He was told that Charles's decision was not temporary, not limited to that morning, not something that would soften once tempers cooled. It marked a new boundary around all future access. A sealed internal note made the change impossible to deny. The phrase proximity risk was recorded, turning Andrew's presence from a family discomfort into a formal palace concern. Those two words carried devastating force. They reduced years of rank, memory, and brotherhood into a warning label inside the institution he once moved through with ease. Andrew finally understood that the door had not merely closed for one meeting, it had closed on an era. Yet the deepest shift did not happen in the official note. It happened later, when Charles and William met without aides present. Behind a closed private door, father and son finally said what the institution had been too afraid to say aloud. There were no officials in the room when Charles faced William. No polished minutes, no palace language to soften the truth. Just a king, a future king, and the heavy knowledge that family mercy can become institutional weakness. Charles had canceled the meeting, but William needed to know whether his father would hold the line after the shock faded and the family pressure began. Charles stood in his study with the cancelled Privy Council papers placed between them like a silent witness. The folder had followed him from the chamber, from the corridor, from the moment when Andrew's presence turned royal order into family reckoning. William entered without the aggression others expected from him, but his calm carried its own force. The prince had long believed the monarchy survives only when personal loyalty does not override public trust. That belief mattered, because the crown was not protected by affection, memory, or bloodline alone. It lived or failed through discipline. It depended on whether the public believed royal power was being guarded, not shared through private favors and old family habits. William chose his words with care, but he did not soften the meaning. He told Charles that Andrew could not be allowed to test boundaries until someone finally stopped moving them. The sentence landed heavily because both men knew it was true. Andrew had not simply appeared near a room. He had appeared near the Privy Council, the formal body that helps the monarch approve important state and royal decisions. His closeness to that space made the issue larger than embarrassment. It raised a dangerous question. If a former working royal could drift near constitutional business after warnings had already been written, what else inside the palace could still be bent by old loyalties? Charles listened without interruption. Sadness stayed in his face, not as weakness, but as proof that the decision had cost him something real. He admitted that canceling the meeting felt like closing a door on part of his own past. Andrew was not a stranger to him. He was a brother tied to childhood, ceremony, grief, and family history. Yet the king also understood that the throne leaves no room for selective courage. A monarch cannot defend authority in public and excuse disorder in private. So Charles gave William the promise the future king needed to hear. Andrew would not be permitted near Privy Council proceedings again, and any aide who enabled that access would be removed from the chain. William did not celebrate. He simply nodded, because this was not victory. It was painful protection. The prince understood that Charles had chosen the crown, but he also saw the wound behind the choice. Father and son stood in silence with the folder between them, knowing the palace would soon craft careful words for the public. Yet those words would be shaped by a private vow made without witnesses, without comfort, and without escape. But no palace statement could stop the outside world from turning one cancelled meeting into the image that defined the crown's crisis. By morning, the palace no longer owned the story. The silence outside the council chamber had become a national image, sharpened by headlines, broadcasters, and crowds reading meaning into every detail. What began as a private royal cancellation became a public verdict on discipline, blood, and power. The monarchy had tried to close a door quietly, but Britain heard the sound. Charles had hoped the palace could contain the damage with careful wording, but the truth had already outrun the statement. Officials released a controlled message saying the Privy Council session had been postponed due to revised scheduling requirements. And Andrew's name was not mentioned once. That omission was meant to calm the storm, yet it did the opposite. The Privy Council, the formal body that helps the monarch approve important royal and state matters, was not a meeting people expected to vanish without reason. Its sudden cancellation mattered because it touched the credibility of the crown itself. If such a serious gathering could be stopped by one figure at one door, then the public would not see a diary problem. They would see a palace fighting itself. Camilla read the morning coverage alone, and the headlines unsettled her more than any private briefing had. She understood immediately that the story was no longer about procedure. It had become about influence around Charles, about who could reach him, who could advise him, and who might still believe old family channels could bend royal discipline. The Queen Consort had already heard whispers that her office had been drawn into the schedule review, and now the public noise made every internal question feel sharper. She turned the page slowly, but the meaning was impossible to avoid. The cancellation had escaped the palace walls, and once that happened, even silence became evidence. Charles saw the front page without speaking. A London newspaper had run a stark image of Buckingham Palace gates beneath the headline, "The door Charles closed." The words cut straight through the palace statement. No one needed Andrew's name printed in large letters to understand who stood behind the drama. The king folded the newspaper once and placed it face down, refusing to let anyone read his reaction. That small act carried the pain of the entire crisis. He had chosen authority, but now the choice belonged to the country too. A broadcaster soon framed the cancellation as, "The morning the king chose the crown over the brother," and the private decision became a national symbol. Andrew heard the phrasing through others and understood how completely the story had shifted against him. He was no longer merely the man turned away from a meeting. He had become the reason Charles looked decisive, wounded, and exposed all at once. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered with phones raised toward the gates, not shouting, not celebrating, simply waiting for meaning to emerge from the silence. Inside, the palace understood the final battle would not be about denial. It would be about what this moment proved. And when the noise finally settled, one truth remained clearer than any statement the palace could write. In the end, the cancelled Privy Council was not remembered as a scheduling disruption. It became the moment Charles proved what kind of king he was willing to be. Not untouched by pain, not free from family history, but capable, at last, of drawing a line where sentiment could no longer stand. Andrew waited at the door. Charles closed it, and the monarchy changed. Charles returned to the council folder later, not as a man seeking comfort, but as a monarch accepting the cost of his own decision. The Privy Council, a formal group that helps the sovereign approve important royal and state matters, had been stopped because Andrew appeared where duty could not allow him to stand. That mattered because the meeting itself was never the deepest issue. The deeper question was whether royal blood could still drift into spaces where only authority, discipline, and public trust belonged. Charles had answered that question without a speech. He had answered it by refusing to continue. He had answered it by letting one painful cancellation become the clearest boundary of his reign. Andrew left the palace without the restoration he had expected. He had arrived believing old memory might still open a door, believing the family's past might soften the institution's present. Instead, he carried the humiliation of a man who discovered that history no longer guaranteed access. That suffering was not small, because Andrew had not merely been denied a meeting, he had been denied the illusion that proximity meant influence. Charles understood that wound, and that understanding made the decision heavier. The king had not defeated a stranger. He had wounded someone who once stood close to him, and he had done it because the crown could not survive another blurred line. William's quiet influence became part of the final verdict, but the prince did not need to force the moment. He had warned, waited, and then stood firm when the crisis proved him right. The future king understood that monarchy survives through restraint as much as power, and he helped ensure Charles's decision would not be undone by guilt, pressure, or private pleading. Inside the palace, the final internal decision became firm. Andrew's pathway to constitutional proximity was closed. Constitutional proximity meant being near the rooms, papers, and people connected to official royal authority, and once that door was shut, the ambiguity ended with it. The monarchy survived the shock not because it avoided pain, but because Charles accepted it. The crown chose discipline over nostalgia, duty over blood, and authority over silence. Andrew's waiting at the door became the image of an old world trying to return, while Charles's refusal became the answer that defined the new one. This was the day the palace learned that a king's most powerful command is sometimes not spoken from a throne, but delivered by refusing to open a door. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next